Good morning. My name is Adam Smith and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Nobel Prize Outreach, and it's my very great pleasure to be your guide and moderator for today's symposium. As you'll see from the programme, during the course of the morning, we'll have a wonderful series of talks from a group of experts introducing us to the promise of nuclear medicine for fighting cancer. Throughout those talks, you'll have the possibility to submit questions using the chat function. And at the end of the morning, we're going to have a roundtable where we'll be joined by all the speakers and we'll address your questions. So please do send them in during the course of the morning. But before we start, we wanted to put the voice of the patient first. A few days ago, I had the chance to talk to Tordis von Feder, who, following treatment for neuroendocrine cancer, had her first experience of nuclear medicine. That interview will be available for full viewing, but we just wanted to play a very short excerpt now, just to open things up. So please roll the video of Tordis. What was the first moment that you heard the phrase nuclear medicine used?
When I was in the hospital to the first, to the diagnostic, 4 years ago. I've never heard it before.
Why do you think that more people are not able to be put on that track early on?
I think a lot of doctors doesn't know this tumor and the possibilities of this diagnostic therapies.
From your own experience of working in this world of public-private partnership, what advice would you have for the delegates, how they should approach their discussions?
To be pragmatical.
Now, next we have an introductory comment from a member of the European Parliament, Maria de Grassa Carvalho. And that was pre-recorded, and so let's listen to her now.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the invitation at this symposium dedicated to advancements in the nuclear medicine. I would like to welcome all of you, and also on behalf of my colleagues, members of the European Parliament, and in particular Mr. Patriciello. I will be very concise, as the eminent speakers that will follow my intervention will explore the matter in different angles, giving a complete overview of the last advancements. Nuclear medicine is an exciting medical specialty. It was already in use decades ago. The first applications date after the Second World War and were about the treatment of thyroid cancer. Nowadays, this branch is very promising because it's able to combine medicine with biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, artificial intelligence, standing at the crossroads of many areas. Nuclear medicine promises the shortest path to precision medicine and can intervene in the fight against cancer, but also in cardiac and neuropsychological disorders. It is already transforming the way diseases like cancer and mental health conditions are treated. There is an enormous potential in the interlinkage between nuclear medicine and digitalization, with a particular reference to application of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence and the machine learning-based approach are progressively shaping the future of our health systems. These technologies are increasingly finding their way into various areas of medicine. For years, AI has captured society imagination and generated enthusiasm for its potential to improve our lives. It already plays an integral role in our daily routines and interactions with media, with transportation and communications. The future will be characterized by a further intensification of the adoption of AI techniques, algorithms, automated machines, and other technologies in healthcare to improve image scanning, reading, processing, and reconstruction, diseases diagnosis, health management, therapies development, and so on. The use of AI-based technologies can be very beneficial in advancements on cancer treatments. Given the large number of patients diagnosed with cancer and with significant amount of data generated during cancer treatment, there is a specific interest in the application of AI to improve oncological care. AI can manage the use of chemotherapy drugs and predict the tolerance of those drugs to optimize the therapy regime. AI can help doctors to make correct treatment decisions, reduce unnecessary surgeries, and help oncologists to improve patients' cancer treatment plans. In nuclear medicine, AI will have a profound impact, both on technological aspects and on image reading. These developments will lead to a better image quality, shorter acquisition time, and lower radiation doses. In recent years, a huge progress was made in the fields of radiochemistry, radiology, scanner technology, and computational analysis of complex patterns, and these have resulted in sophisticated methods to diagnose, detect, and successfully treat cancer. Artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques are becoming an integral part of biomedical research and healthcare. I would like to conclude my short intervention today by passing you three messages that I think are relevant, at least to me. The European industry is very active and for decades have been at the forefront of the technology. Many of the world's top researchers and strongest companies in this sector are European. So there is a clear need to support nuclear medicine at European level. We need to facilitate the availability for medical use, allow the seamless connection of hospitals and distribution sites across the EU, enabling education, skill creation, and awareness, promoting and invest further research and infrastructure development. Second message is big data are already in use to train machine learning models in some areas, but they are vital in the digitalization of health sector, and their wider use still encounters significant obstacles. We need to improve our system to collect and treat big amounts of data, and the development of common European cloud spaces for health might be beneficial for nuclear medicine. Third, and lastly, we need more research collaboration, more cooperation in the field of biomedical science, all along its value chain from fundamental research to clinical research. I thank again Nuclear Medicine Europe for this opportunity. I remind you to keep the European Parliament informed and involved in your initiatives, and I wish you fruitful discussions and the good continuation of your works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, happily in this virtual environment, I am joined by some real people with me on this call, and one of them is Professor Fred Zilbigen, who is president of the Dutch Society for Nuclear Medicine. And he's going to introduce us now to nuclear medicine imaging and treatment in the first of our talks. So, Fred, may I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Adam. I have the honor to give the first presentation about the basics of nuclear medicine. The next speakers will dive into the deep and give more detailed information about specific aspects of nuclear medicine. There are several medical imaging techniques like ultrasound, CT, and MRI, but nuclear medicine is unique as it provides not only structural but also functional information of organs and tissues. To be able to provide this information, radioactive tracers, or as we like to call them, radiopharmaceuticals, are used, and they are essential for our work. These radiopharmaceuticals may be able to be used for therapeutic applications as well. About the principles of nuclear medicine, a specific molecule which is able to target the organ of interest is tagged with a gamma-emitting radioisotope, and in most cases injected intravenously. The distribution of the radio-labeled molecule throughout the body is imaged with a gamma camera. This way, early physiologic responses to disease may be detected and generally before any structural changes take place. Like I put on the lower part of my slide. Something about the history of nuclear medicine, only a few words, although there is so much I would like to tell you, but I have a limited amount of time. Going back to the 30s of last century, knowledge about radionuclides for medicine goes back to this period. In these years, mainly radioiodine was available. Clinically relevant imaging started with the invention of the gamma or scintillation camera in 1958. Since then, a wealth of imaging developments and radiopharmaceuticals emerged. Some global facts about nuclear medicine. First of all, over 10,000 hospitals worldwide use radioisotopes in medicine. Over 40 million nuclear medicine procedures are performed each year. And 90% of them are for diagnostic purposes solely. The demand for radioisotopes is increasing with 5% annually. In the US, over 20 million procedures are done each year, and in Europe, over 10 million. Visualized in this part of the slides. So nuclear medicine is available throughout the world. Then about nuclear medicine technology. Advances in scanners and development of new radiopharmaceuticals form the basis of rapid progress in nuclear medicine. In the lower left panel, a SPECT gamma camera enabling detailed information from every direction is visible. On the right, SPECT CT cameras combining functional imaging with the SPECT camera and structural information with the CT scanner. In the lower middle panel is a combined PET and CT scanner visualized. The development in technology goes hand in hand with new radiopharmaceuticals, but also with new indications and a more and more improved position in oncology imaging. Nuclear medicine is very vividly. To be able to perform nuclear medicine, you need a team and you need facilities. First, about facilities. Every department of nuclear medicine needs a radiopharmacy to produce the radioisotopes. We need scanners, we need reporting rooms, and we need treatment rooms for radionuclide therapy. In the scientific staff of nuclear medicine departments, you will find nuclear medicine physicians, radiopharmacists, physicists, and sometimes even radiochemists. Furthermore, nuclear medicine technologists and nurses are indispensable to do our work. And finally, of course, the administrative staff is necessary to perform our clinical work. Nuclear medicine is all about SPECT and PET traces. In the left lower panel, you will find many SPECT traces listed there. Each of them targets a specific organ. For instance, technetium sulfur fallout on the upper one, is used for imaging liver function. Technetium NDP for bone imaging, DMSA for renal imaging, and krypton gas for ventilation imaging, and so on. The radioactive part of radiopharmaceutical in most compounds is technetium with a single photon, but the non-radioactive part of the molecule determines the target, which is the organ or tissue. PET radiopharmaceuticals, on the right, essentially are positrons, which emit two photons in opposite directions, which make them perfectly fit for exact localization, but also quantification of the activity in the tissues. Fluor FDG, the upper one, is concentrated in highly metabolic active tissue, which makes the radiopharmaceutical perfectly fit for imaging of many different tumors. Fluor PSMA, the third one in a row, is a sensitive prostate cancer PET tracer. How do nuclear medicine scans work? After intravenous injection of the radiotracer, the patient becomes radioactive. Depicted in this picture. The patient is positioned on the camera table, and the radiation is picked up by the detectors of the camera. This is a scan on the right, with numerous metastatic lesions throughout the bones. Examples of conventional nuclear medicine. These are typical examples of brain, bone, thyroid, parathyroid imaging, and so on. Most of these procedures are regarded as evergreens since they are already lost from the 70s of last century, but most of them are still performed in every part of nuclear medicine. The images don't look so beautiful and clear as recent developments allow us to image, but nevertheless they are still working quite well. Then about hybrid imaging. When it comes to more precise localization and structural information, we prefer hybrid imaging. That means that combining the gamma camera or SPECT camera with CT, or like in this case, the PET image on the left, the CT scan in the middle, and the overlay shows the PET scan projected in the CT for detailed information of the metabolic activity with exact localization. This is the PET scan. Then we demonstrate the CT scan in the middle. And on the right side will appear the CT scan with the PET scan as a kind of overlay. This way, localization, size, relation with its environment of the tumor can be exactly visualized, but also followed throughout treatment. Some examples of SPECT CT scans. In this case, I mentioned some clinical applications, for instance, for brain imaging, respiratory imaging, cardiovascular, endocrinology, gastrointestinal imaging, etc. There are a numerous range of applications available for imaging, and like I said, the combination of functional and structural imaging make them very attractive. This is an example of some bone scans, SPECT scans of the bone, in this case the hip. You see several locations with increased uptake of the bone tracer, and the combination of the CT scan and the bone scan make them very clear and easily to read and understand, also for the orthopedic surgeon. So SPECT improve localization, improve characterization, detection, and diagnostic confidence, which is very helpful. I particularly like the image on the left lower side of the wrist with increased uptake, which was not visible on the CT scan. The same for PET-CT. This is a situation with increased uptake in the head and neck area. The combination of the PET scan and CT allows clear localization of the PET uptake and thus the tumor site. They are used for differentiation between benign and malignant tissue, for staging of tumors, monitoring the effect of treatment, detecting tumor recurrence, and so on. Most of the PET-CTs are made in the field of oncology, but also in infection imaging and cardiac diseases. PET-CT in oncology, the story so far, PET-CT is a clear game changer. Nuclear medicine has become so important in oncology imaging since significant impact on staging of most cancers, significant impact in restaging in many cancers, significant impact in the assessment of treatment responses in most cancers, and so on. PET-CT in oncology is growing very rapidly. There's extensive evidence of the value of the PET-CT scan in clinical oncology so far. PET-MRI is a new development, a combination of PET scan and MRI, and there are some clear clinical applications emerging at this moment. Then radiocardiac surgery is a branch with very interesting clinical applications. It is quite in the beginning of development, but nevertheless, we expect a lot of this. During surgery, the radioactive localization allows the surgeon to remove the tumor and metastasis from the normal tissue. Radionuclide therapy and Theognostics is becoming more and more important in nuclear medicine. These are some indications. Theognostics is a buzzword at this moment in nuclear medicine. It means that when you merge therapy and diagnostics, you get this ugly word, but it says that the targeting molecule is the same as in the diagnostic and the therapeutic procedure, and only the radioactive part of the compound differs. In both situations, the radiopharmaceutical will move to the same location on the target, but with a different effect. You will receive much more information in the next presentations. These applications here are accepted worldwide for thyroid cancer, liver cancer, prostate cancer, and so on. This area is moving very rapidly and becoming much more interesting. Some words about the cost of nuclear medicine. Nuclear medicine is not cheap, but cost-effective in many oncologic situations, like in staging of non-small cell lung cancer, diagnosis of pulmonary nodules, staging and restaging of lymphomas, and in patients with head and neck cancer. The use of LG PET-CT reduces the per patient secondary lifetime costs by almost £1,500. In conclusion, nuclear medicine includes functional imaging with extensive applications both in oncology and non-oncology applications. In hybrid imaging, it provides structural and functional information, and radionuclide therapy plays an important role in several cancers. Finally, I would like to thank Gopinath Gnanasegaram from the Royal Free Hospital in London for preparing the slides. It was quite difficult to present it this way because of issues with themes, but nevertheless, I hope that you learned a lot from this basic presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Fred. And yes, it's a challenging environment to tell a story in, but I think you did a marvelous job, and it was a very thorough and fascinating overview. So thank you very much indeed. And we'll have the chance to talk to you more in the roundtable at the end of the morning. So thank you.
Thank you.
And so now another solution to this challenging environment, it will come from Professor Nicola Fazio from the European Institute of Oncology in Milan. And good morning, Nicola. So you're with us, but of course you pre-recorded your talk. So that's a different way of dealing with this. And you're going to talk about the clinical management of patients with neuroendocrine tumors. So we'll play that video now, and then we will meet you in the roundtable at the end. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation. So the title of my talk is the Personalized Multidisciplinary Clinical Management of Patients with Neuroendocrine Tumors. These are my disclosures. Neuroendocrine tumors are part, as you can see here, of the category named more in general neuroendocrine neoplasms that comprises tumors and carcinomas. Tumors are NET and carcinomas NEC. NET are usually slow growing and they have a relatively good prognosis, whereas carcinomas are quite fast growing and have a relatively poor prognosis. Luckily, the NET are the majority. NET are rare malignancies according to the definition of rare cancer in Europe, that is less than 6 new cases per out of 100,000 people per year. And in Europe, this is the number now, but the incidence is quite increasing. NETs, the tumors, usually develop from the gastroenteropancreatic tract, that is the digestive system, in other words, and in less common cases from the lung. Neuroendocrine carcinomas, or NEC, instead are usually from lung, as the small cell lung cancer is the most frequent, and in the other cases from head and neck tract or genitourinary, and only in very rare cases they develop in the gastroenteropancreatic tract. These are the therapies that were approved by FDA and EMA over the last decades, especially the last decade. And you can see here that in the 70s, streptozotocin, that is a chemotherapy, was approved for pancreatic NET. And over the last years, other drugs, lanreotide or octreotide, that are the somatostatin analogs, were approved for the gastroenteropancreatic NETs. Sunitinib and everolimus, that are biological agents with different mechanisms of action, were approved for pancreatic NETs. And the latest approval regarded the PRRT peptide peptide receptor radionuclide therapy in JEPNET. But in JEPNET patients, we have also the opportunity to use other therapies not specifically approved for these patients, for example, liver-directed treatments, surgical and non-surgical, or other chemotherapeutics. So the PRRT in NET is, in other words, the lutetium-177.8, the Lutathera, and the Lutathera was approved by EMA specifically for the gastroenteropancreatic NET with G1 and G2 categories, somatostatin receptor positive, of course. What does it mean, G1 and G2? According to the WHO JEPNET classification that you can see here, G1 and G2 means less than 20% of Ki67. Ki67 is a proliferative index it can give us an idea about the speed of the cell to reproduce themselves. So G1 and G2 are the target of the PRRT in JEPNET, on the basis, of course, of the approval. So let's see what is the therapeutic strategy in patients with advanced JEPNET. Some aspects of the disease and of the patient can be very useful to make a decision in terms of therapy for these tumors in these patients. And first of all, the question is if the tumor is functioning or non-functioning. That, in other words, means that if there is a clinical syndrome just related directly to the tumor, these tumors can produce some hormones that can give some clinical syndromes. The most common is the carcinoid syndrome. Second, it's important to know if the tumor can be developed within an inherited syndrome or if it is sporadic. Some inherited syndromes exist for JEPNETs. The most frequent is the MEN1, and it's important in some cases to verify if we are within this genetic syndrome, as the therapeutic decision can change. Finally, another important information is if the tumor expresses the somatostatin receptor subtype 2. That is an important target of the PRRT, and it can be detected by means of the PET gallium-68 PET-CT DOTA peptide. Actually, this SSTR2 can be detected even by the pathologist by means of the immunohistochemistry, but what we need in our clinical practice is the functional expression of this receptor. As you can see here, this intense staining at the gallium-68 PET-CT. So gallium-68 is a critical exam that should be performed in these patients. So let's see a practical example. If you have a patient, like in this case, a 52-year-old female patient with a neuroendocrine tumor, G2. G2 means less than 20% Ki67 and more than 2%. The primary site is the tail of the pancreas. You can see here in the CT scan. This is the CT scan. Liver-only metastasis. This has a big metastasis in the liver. You can see here. SSTR2 positive. That means that this intense staining here at the gallium PET that is perfectly concordant with the CT scan. You can see here. So SSTR2 is very positive. No syndrome, no clinical syndrome, no inherited syndrome. In this case, we have a quite a long list of possible therapies that could be proposed: somatostatin analog, SSA, everolimus or sunitinib, chemotherapy or PRRT, or some direct approach, locoregional liver-directed treatment or primary tumor surgery. The problem is that currently we don't have any specific therapeutic sequence really validated, or we don't have any absolute evidence about a specific priority of each of some therapy or a specific sequence. Therefore, we could find some help in some guidelines. These are the main international guidelines in Europe, with that from the ESMO, European Society of Medical Oncology, and that from the European Neuroendocrine Tumor Society. But the most important point is that for a sort of ideal therapeutic approach to JEPNET patients, it should be involved a net referral center. And in net referral center, there should be a multidisciplinary team. This multidisciplinary team, the MDT, should be composed by non-dedicated specialists, specifically dedicated to these tumors. And the MDT should share preferably a therapeutic strategy rather than the single therapy. So ideally, the multidisciplinary discussion should be the first step of each diagnostic and therapeutic management of patients with gastroenteropancreatic and neuroendocrine tumors. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Nicola, thank you very, very much indeed. Beautifully done, very succinct, lots of information. Thank you. So again, we'll speak to you at the round table. Now, next we come to Ken Herman, Professor Ken Herman, who is from the University Clinic in Essen, and he is chair of the European Association of Nuclear Medicine Oncology and Theranostics Committee. And he's going to look to the future of nuclear medicine in his talk, which also has been pre-recorded. So please enjoy Ken Herman's talk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My title is indeed a little bit challenging, as I have to raise more questions than I will provide answers, but it's actually a fun job to do, and I'm looking forward to the next 10 minutes. These are my disclosures according to the ENM recommendations. However, none of them are really in relevance to what I'm going to discuss in the next minutes. My talk is structured to 3 parts. First of all, I want to briefly touch upon the questions which we have successfully answered in the last years. Then I want to explicitly take time to mention and discuss questions which are currently unanswered and which need to be answered, and then conclude on a short outlook for future next steps. One big question we always were confronted with in nuclear medicine was, are we really able to execute and successfully conduct phase 3 studies which are necessary to really convince our friends and colleagues from oncology? And here, this slide summarizes 2 of the most recent, very successful publications showing that indeed radioligand therapy is feasible in part of phase 3 studies to show that these therapies are superior to standard clinical therapies. On the left side, the groundbreaking NETA-1 study. This is a study showing that patients who received 4 cycles of radioligand therapy, PRT, had a significant longer progression-free survival than patients who had a high dose of cold, non-radioactive sandostatin. This study was performed in patients with neuroendocrine tumors, mainly duodenales. And what also is obviously already from the first view quite impressive is that these curves are quite different. And if you look at the hazard ratios, not mentioned here, but it is really the case that patients who did not undergo PRT had a 5 times higher likelihood to experience progression than patients who were treated with PRT. This study, published in 2017, is really the hallmark of the modern times of nuclear medicine and radioligand therapy. And on the right side, this is a study which was the results first shown at ASCO this year, and then now published in September in the New England Journal, showing a prospective phase 3 study using PSMA targeted radioligand therapy. In this case, patients in 3rd line or later, which means patients had a prior at least 1 line of novel anti-androgen and 1 line of chemotherapy, were randomized either into up to 6 cycles of PSMA radioligand therapy plus standard of care or only standard of care alone. The reason I'm mentioning it's at least 3rd line is because many of the patients already had also 3, 4, or even 5 lines before they were finally offered participation in this trial. And here, when we look at the overall survival, which is highly relevant in a tumor like prostate cancer, we can see that indeed the median is 15.3 months compared to 11.3 months. And the hazard ratio of 0.62 is something which is really, as our colleagues from urology and uro-oncology say, indeed has the potential to be a game changer. So this is one of the questions successfully answered. We are able to conduct phase 3 studies prospectively, which are necessary to really be accepted on the level of oncologists and other clinicians. A second important question is, once we conduct these trials, are we also able to really cross the finish line and get approval from the authorities? On the left side, this was based on the NETA-1 study, indeed, the FDA approval and then a little bit later the EMA approval of Lutathera, the lutetium-177 dotatate by Novartis and AAA. And this is FDA approved and EMA approved and available. And on the right side, at least the announcement from FDA that there is priority review granted for lutetium PSMA-617 in mCRPC, and we expect FDA approval and EMA approval in 2022. Another big question always was that is there really money to be made in the field of nuclear medicine and reliance therapy? And again, first of all, this is not showing that money was being made. This mainly shows that the money was able to be raised. But we know that Wall Street is obviously very often much smarter than many of us. And you can see that in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been quite a lot of money influx into the space. And obviously, the two highlight transaction was the $3.9 billion acquisition of Novartis, done by Novartis of AAA, and the same one for $2.1 billion, the Novartis acquiring Endocyte. But many others also show that indeed there is a quite interest in, from a business point per view, and usually they only invest money if this is a quite reasonable business opportunity. Now, the second part, I want to focus on the questions which are currently not answered yet, and we have to answer in the future. So one big challenge is going to be, is nuclear medicine and theranostics actually ready for scale-up? Like mentioned before, the data for PSMA-617 looks very promising. We expect approval in early and late 2022, depending if it's FDA or EMA. And we also know from the numbers that we expect a significant increase in patient referral and overall demand. And now, are we able to really meet the expectation? Are we able to meet the demand? Many countries are not really ready for the rollout. One big question mark, obviously, it's US, because nuclear medicine overall is not very strong there, traditionally, in the last years. Also, France, UK, strong countries, also countries with strong nuclear medicine, but do they have the means and the trained personnel to really scale up the theranostic centers to meet the demand by patients? Another big question is who's going to administer reliance therapy. Of course, in certain countries where you have a strong nuclear medicine department and infrastructure, they will try to keep their hands on the therapy. But the big question is what's going to happen in the US. Is it going to be radiation oncology? Is it going to be oncology? Or is nuclear medicine finding its way to grow? One of the big questions which has to be solved. Even in Germany, where we have a strong tradition of nuclear medicine and we already have an experience of applying reliance therapy, I'm not 100% sure if we really have enough diagnostic centers and also sufficient trained personnel to meet the demand, which we will see once PSMA-617 is approved and many other new therapies are coming, hopefully soon. One hope is that obviously a collaboration of ENM, SNMI, and IEAR together, that they will be able to tackle this issue, what I like to call the issue of the last mile, obviously taking this comparison of logistics, but it's not only important to get the medication approved, to get it distributed to the site, but make sure that the patient really gets access to this medication. Another set of question is if the business model I showed you before is really sustainable. We know that the history, when we look back into the history, that Civil and Bexa were unfortunately, despite being really very potent and successful drugs, financial failures. We also know that Xofigo, which is a drug which includes radium-223, which has shown one of the most promising and first phase 3 studies with significant survival benefit of patients, in date was not as commercially as successful as really expected. And for example, in Germany, one of the problems could have been that the people who administered the treatment, that they were not reimbursed adequately. So for example, the money which was actually behind the procedure was only 2% of the drug costs. So this obviously is a challenge, and if we do not solve this for the future, then this might not be a sustainable model. Another thing is that PRT, the rollout, and when you look at the numbers, was not as fast as expected. And the big question is why? Is it because there were not enough people who are really willing to apply the treatment, or was it rather that the people who are controlling the patient and the patient flow, were not aware or not willing to refer the patients for PRT. So it's one of the challenges we have to obviously tackle in the future as well. And a big question is, this is how do we make sure that we incentivize the person who is leading the patient? How can we make sure that he really refers the patient to us who administer the radioligand therapy? And another big issue overall, if you look at the cost of goods and the logistical complexity of radioligand therapy, it is obviously more complex and more troublesome than, for example, of just producing pills and distributing them without a half-life. One big question also is Theranostics indeed platform technology, or is it just a one-hit wonder as PRT and PSMA? As for example, when you look at the songs of Rick Astley, who had 2 really world-class songs, but then nothing else happened. Another question is, we are very often sure that radioligand therapy is very simple. You only need a specific ligand, then you use a chelator and you combine it with a radionuclide. And this looks a little bit like it's plug and play, but is it really just plug and play? It's probably much more complex. And can we transfer this system to other opportunities? And then a big demand and question is, so far, mainly peptides and small molecules have been successful. Can we expand beyond to biologics, to single-strand antibodies, to full antibodies? And of course, also, can we take advantage of the large libraries available for both peptides but also antibodies? And only then we can really confirm that Theognostics is a platform technology. And the big question is, what comes next after PSMA? I think the benchmark is set by both the DOTATATE as well as the PSMA 617, and what are the next big things coming? Here, this slide just summarizes you 4 potential opportunities. For example, here the gallium-68 labeled imaging agent for expression of CXCR4, or the currently very popular FAP agent here, also labeled with gallium-68. Or is it the GRPR receptor, in this case NEO-B as an imaging compound, or another target, the carboanhydrase 9, here in this case a zirconium version of the girentuximab. Overall, there are many, many new promising targets and diagnostic concepts currently around, but the big question is which of them is really making it to the approval and to the exception and translation into the clinical routine. Well, I have now raised, as promised, many, many questions. How can we really answer the question? Because many of the questions have to be answered to successfully and sustainable develop radioligand therapy. Well, one thing is, and this is very important, is that academia industry, we really have to join forces. Otherwise, we're not able to successfully scale up the currently approved and soon to be approved therapies. Reimbursement remains a huge challenge, and this is something we really have to pay attention to, and we also have to make sure that we have enough trained workforce to make sure that we really meet the demand and the challenge of the last mile. It's also important, with many new radioligand therapy concepts around the corner, to establish a clear translation and clinical pathway to make this faster, easier, and cheaper. And a big challenge, obviously, is that we have to go beyond nuclear medicine with diagnostics, and also to go beyond oncology. For example, very exciting applications in the cardiac, but also in the inflammatory field, for example, for FAP imaging, but maybe also for FAP-directed therapy. And like I said before, and I'm very, very happy that I was able to give a talk at this meeting here, Europe has always been so far the driver of diagnostics, to make sure that we stay behind the steering wheel, and that we are the ones really driving the innovation of diagnostics in Europe. For this, the NMEU is a very important catalysator, and I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to talk here, and I'm very looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, in our next talk, Johannes Cernin, who is professor at UCLA, is going to talk about the cost of nuclear medicine specifically. This also has been pre-recorded because it's extremely early in the morning in Los Angeles. So over to Johannes Cernin.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I'm not an economist and cannot provide you with a comprehensive analysis of the cost of nuclear medicine, but I will show you some cost definitions in their limitations and provide a recent example illustrating that cost assessments overall and in nuclear medicine in particular require a far-reaching assessment, almost, I would say, to the scale of national and world economies. I am, of course, working in the US healthcare system, which is very different from almost any other systems in the world. My comments are therefore limited as they don't address other healthcare systems. But first, my disclosure statements. None of the data that I show here are related to these interests. So I want to start out with a few definitions to clarify the terms we're using, as cost has multiple and often ambiguous meanings. It means different things for providers, payers, and patients. For providers, such as hospitals, cost means expense incurred to deliver healthcare services. To payers or insurances, cost means the amount of money they pay to providers. And to patients, cost means out-of-pocket payments for healthcare services. Charge or price is, in essence, what providers charge for a health service, yet charges are very different from reimbursement, which is the actual payment made by insurance to a provider. This is usually in the US a fraction of the charges. And finally, there is the term of cost effectiveness, which connects cost with outcomes, whereby effectiveness of an intervention is compared to an alternative or alternate strategy. And the outcome is, for instance, defined as quality adjusted life years saved. This is the most meaningful term in my view, as it now includes patient outcomes, and that's what it should be about. And it has even further reaching implications on a kind of a societal and global level. I want to start the discussion with a well-known example of nuclear medicine, precision medicine, and that is the theranostic pair to image and target or treat therapeutically the prostate-specific membrane antigen, or PSMA. This theranostic pair has gained enormous visibility, and I will use it as an example of oversimplified cost considerations. Imaging of PSMA expression is now FDA approved in the United States. It's Medicare reimbursed, which is the insurance for everyone older than 65 years. And it has become part of the prostate cancer guidelines from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. There are many other targets that are being explored or already exploited clinically, as shown in the box below. And they will be discussed a little bit later. But theranostic targeting of the PSMA receptor is changing the way prostate cancer patients are managed. This is a very simplified diagram that illustrates the concept. You have a target, you have a ligand that can be labeled with a diagnostic or a therapeutic isotope, and you then obtain first images to see the target. And then if the target is expressed, as shown here, then you treat the target with, for instance, 177 lutetium PSMA. And then after treatment, you see all these black spots disappear. The treatment was successful. The question is, of course, how much does the imaging cost? How much does the therapy cost? And is the combination of these two really a fair assessment of overall healthcare impact? Here are three examples of molecular radiotherapies and theranostics. The examples include dotatate for imaging somatostatin receptors, PSMA, as discussed a second ago, and then 223 radium to look at to treat bone metabolism. Let's take PSMA as an example and let's assume an expensive scenario. For instance, the US scenario. A PSMA PET CT scan may cost $5,000, and each lutetium PSMA treatment cycle may cost $50,000, that is. Let's assume that each patient undergoes 3 cycles. This would cost the system around $150,000. If we assume that 40,000 patients a year would undergo this treatment, the total cost would be $6 billion per year. If we use PSMA imaging to determine whether the patient is a suitable treatment candidate, in other words, whether the target is expressed, and we assume a very high cost of $5,000 per scan, we add $200 million to the cost. However, if we, based on imaging, exclude 20% of the patients from treatment because target expression is low or heterogeneous, we save the treatment costs for 8,000 patients, that's 20% of 40,000, or we save $1.2 billion. Thus, the investment in imaging, nuclear medicine imaging, would have saved a net of $1 billion. However, healthcare cost assessment and nuclear medicine cost specifically are much more complex than even this. Matters are more complicated as terms such as cost and effectiveness and reimbursement levels are frequently mixed up and used very liberally. Here we have not analyzed cost and outcomes of alternative treatment strategy, as is done, for instance, in sophisticated decision tree sensitivity analysis. Assume, for instance, that a second taxane treatment would have been given instead of lutetium PSMA, and it would have been effective or not effective, but would have been less expensive, and it would create side effects that may or may not be as expensive or be more expensive than those from molecular radiotherapy. The financial impact of outcomes, side effects, complications, or simply wrong decisions leading to poor or better patients' outcome are not considered here. And even this does not address real cost for society, as improved productivity following a successful treatment may have a much larger economic impact than itemized imaging or therapy costs. In the following, I want to emphasize that issues are more complex, and single examples of adding one new imaging tool may increase healthcare expenditures, but may at the same time lead to enormous cost recovery in other sectors. First, some numbers and facts that underscore the enormity of healthcare and its financial impact. The worldwide discussion of healthcare costs has its roots in societal burden of prioritizing scarce financial resources, in prioritizing and allocating them. What is the value of one quality life saved? Is this value the same for each age group? Who decides the value? These are important ethical and economic questions. The US spends $3.8 billion on healthcare in 2018, which accounted for 24% of total government spending. At the same time, healthcare as a business generated around $1.8 trillion in revenue. Healthcare is the number one employer of 14% of the US workforce. And one should not forget there's also considerable tax revenue from payroll and income to corporate tax. I do not know how these revenues are accounted for in the concept of healthcare expenditures. Whether these monies are well invested is a different question. It should be judged on a patient level by improved quality of life and improved progression-free survival and overall survival in cancer. Moreover, there's little known about the downstream economic effect of improved progression-free and overall survival, such as improved lifetime productivity, which we will get to in a moment. So where do the 3.8 trillion healthcare dollars come from? The panel on the left shows the sources for covering expenses. 73% come from health insurance and 11% from out-of-pocket payments. Again, these are numbers from the United States. But they indicate that patients come up with close to $400 billion to cover healthcare expenditures out of pocket. Of the health insurance contributions, private insurance contributes 31%, while Medicare, Medicaid, and other government programs account for 70%. Panel on the right shows where the money goes. 30% is used for hospital care, 20% for physician services, and 10% for prescription drugs. I would like to mention that administrative costs in the US system are much higher than in any other country. But what about imaging and PET imaging, nuclear medicine imaging in particular? And we looked at this about 10 years ago when we analyzed the Medicare cancer expenditures incurred by PET imaging. At this time, FDG was pretty much the only and lonely player. Thus, the absolute dollar amounts shown here underrepresented as they were based on more than 10-year-old data. However, the relative contributions are probably largely unchanged. In this analysis, non-imaging expenses accounted for 95%, imaging to less than 5%, and nuclear medicine imaging, in this case only PET, for only 1% of Medicare cancer expenses. This is really only a small fraction of the overall costs. Now the landscape is changing now. This was the old nuclear medicine world. Now nuclear medicine is booming. Company revenues are growing quickly. Providers and patients will have to pay more for these services. Diagnostics will grow most dramatically, but growth is expected in all sectors, including conventional nuclear medicine. The nuclear medicine market will grow to more than $13 billion in 2025, and depending on target discovery and the development of diagnostic pairs and imaging biomarkers, this will keep growing at a very fast pace. We now have established and emerging diagnostic and therapeutic approaches. I've outlined them here, but will not go into detail. Some have already generated considerably of the new ones industry excitement, such as inhibitors of fibroblast activation protein, neurotensin, or carbonic anhydrase 9 for renal cancer imaging and therapy. But again, are these just adding costs? How expensive are they? And what is their potential societal benefit? Here, a quick look at the worldwide cancer mortality trends between high versus low and middle income countries. Cancer incidence is decreasing in high income countries, but increasing in low and middle income countries. And the reasons are clear. In high income countries, you have screening, diagnosis, better therapy, smoking cessation programs, vaccinations that, for instance, reduce cervical cancer and head and neck cancers, as is the case for HPV vaccination. In the low-income countries, you have limited screening, no smoking cessation programs, infections, constraints related to diagnosis, which is imaging and treatment. And in fact, the highest incidence of cancers worldwide, cancers of the stomach, liver, esophagus, and cervix, are now coming from low and middle income countries. And here's some more data taken from a recent publication in Lancet Oncology, led by investigators from Harvard, Sloan Kettering, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, in which the impact of treatment and imaging modality availability on 5-year cancer survival was estimated. The table shows stage distribution and 5-year survival for 11 selected cancers stratified by income levels. And these data are really sobering. For instance, stage 1 cancers have worldwide an overall 5-year net survival of 77%. However, in low-income countries, the survival is only 8.4%. And if you go to stage 4 cancers, worldwide survival is 25%. And in low-income countries, it's only 2.5%. So these data tell you that there's an incredible disparity. And the authors concluded that even after accounting for stage of diagnosis, we find large differences in survival by income group, with 5-year net survival an average of 12 times higher in high income than in low income countries. How can this dramatic disparity be addressed? In the same paper, the authors modeled the impact of introducing quality of care standards, all treatment modalities, and advanced imaging modalities on 5-year survival in countries with varying income levels. Shown here is the example of 5-year survival of cervical cancers with cumulative scale-up of treatment and imaging. The 4 lines represent the countries with different income levels. Improving the quality of care and introducing therapy options has the greatest impact on survival. However, imaging, including ultrasound, X-ray, CT, MRI, PET, and SPECT, also had a significant impact on 5-year survival from low to upper middle income countries. In a recent leadership discussion for the Journal of Nuclear Medicine, I asked Mike Sateke, who's the leading African molecular imaging theranostics expert, whether nuclear medicine techniques could be considered luxury items when developing healthcare systems in Africa. He responded forcefully by saying, "It is wrong to say we don't need CT and other techniques. It's the wrong message." What he meant was that we would simply give politicians an easy excuse and way out for not aiming for excellence in healthcare in developing countries. Back to the cost of nuclear medicine and overall imaging, and in fact going beyond cost in its traditional assessment. A subsequent paper in Lancet Oncology, authored by many of the same authors, modeled and analyzed the impact of high-level imaging on cost and survival in countries of various income levels. Data are shown here. Scale up of imaging could reduce cancer deaths by 3.2%, which sounds low, but this means 2.5 million cancer deaths between 2020 and 2030. This would add $6.8 billion in costs, but results in lifetime productivity gains of $1.2 trillion. In other words, for every dollar invested in scaling up imaging, the net return can be as much as $179. If one scales up quality of care, imaging, and therapy, so all of the three pillars of potential improvements, 12.5% or 9.6 million of cancer deaths could be avoided, and the return on investment could be as much as $12 for every dollar spent. So costs versus healthcare and economic benefits of scaling up diagnostic imaging for cancer, in my view, represents a very strong case for investment. I want to summarize and conclude here. Itemizing individual procedure health therapy costs provide limited insights into the economic impact of health systems. Healthcare is a complex system that cannot be analyzed by simply adding or subtracting itemized expenses for individual procedures. A holistic view is needed. Scaling up medical imaging and access to nuclear medicine can induce substantial health benefits for patients. Imaging alone results in markedly improved healthcare outcomes in developing and developed countries. Scaling up quality of care, diagnostics, and therapeutics in developing and developed countries may be the best investment socially and economically, as lifetime productivity will increase substantially. Thank you very much for your attention.
And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Yolanda Konikovska from the Medical University in Warsaw, who is also president of the European Association of Nuclear Medicine. And continuing this survey of the many issues surrounding nuclear medicine and how to make the most of it, she is going to address the question of education and training. So, Yolanda, over to you.
Thanks for a very nice, kindly introduction me. And I will be sharing my screen and hopefully you will be seeing my presentation. Yeah, it's not working. Today I want to share with you if this multidisciplinary treatment and management with the training. As you saw that we are all talking about the radioligand therapy, and we need to answer for whom will be this using, because it was starting from the beginning that even our first the treatment with the radioiodine is radioisotopic treatment, but now we have the most sophisticated like this the treatment for this radioligand therapy, and we have two randomized trials. The first, it was mentioned by Professor Ken Herman and Nicola Frasi, that NETTER trials for these neuroendocrine tumors, which provide us that very good results with reduction, 79% of reduction of risk disease of progression or death, as well as this significant improvement in quality of life. And this very recently published the VISION trials for this castrate-resistant prostate cancer patient. The same, very good results, nearly the 40% reduction of the death and 60% reduction of the risk progression. Both of them had significant improvement of survival parameters. If you look for this kind of the therapy, first of all, we need to answer that we want to treat the patient with the personalized treatment and personalized imaging. But for this, we need to answer what for us is exactly the tumors. And probably most of you know that we are dealing on the beginning with a not, that's an easy game, because we are talking about the polyclonal tumors. That means that of course, we have the histopathology, but histopathology is made by the primary tumors or with some small sample tissue. But during the disease, there's different is the behavior of this kind of the tumors and different phenotyping. If you have the image with this different kind of the phenotyping of the cells, basis on this phenotyping imaging, we could use it with this our nuclear medicine techniques. We could on this based place the targeted therapy. And it was mentioned several times that is exactly the basis of targeted therapy. That means the image-based therapy. Why we need this phenotyping imaging? We have the example, very well known, somatostatin receptors positive in neuroendocrine tumors. And we know that the majority of this well-differentiation tumor are expressing with the somatostatin receptors and are not avid with the FDG, which give us metabolic behavior of the tumors. But during the disease, we could see that these tumors could be differentiation as well. We have the different clone of the tumors. And this is the scale proposed by the Australian groups, with, as you can see, the 5 points of the scales, where you could see this somatostatin positive and FDG negative. On the end, we have somatostatin negative and FDG positive, but we have a lot of the variety between them. What it is important for us that this phenotyping give us very strong impact for the survivor of the patient, as you can see on these graphs below. And the same nearly the experience we have now with the prostate cancer patient. It was the first example for this phase 2 phase 2 trials, as well as this procedural guidelines for the NM. You could find that to qualify the patient for the therapy for this PSMA base, we need to check not only that we have the expression, but how is this expression, because the patient with the low expression will not benefit with our therapy. As well, during the disease, we could see this concordant FDG and PSMA scan. And what we know for the vision trials, as you can see, that nearly the 30% didn't meet the criteria for the PSM therapy. Professor Cernin showed us how is this impact of this for this budget perspective. But for us as a physician is the most important thing that primo is non-nocere. And second is the regulatory safety of the patient. That means if we treat this patient with the agent which is not which is not good for this patient and the patient is not suitable for the therapy, we didn't achieve the therapy effect and will we have only the side effects. As you see, this process is quite complex, and for all of this, we need to have the multidisciplinary team. We need to sit together, we need to discuss, but we must think that in the middle of us is exactly the patient, and we must think about this personalized therapy. So how it should be this composition of this team? First of all, it should be the clinician. It depends on the disease, endocrinologists, urologists, gastrologists, which give us the history of the patient and who will be the starting point for the diagnostic image. For the diagnostic image, we need both. We need the radiology, which gives us the anatomical imaging, as well as I told you, and I showed on my this presentation on the beginning, we need this phenotyping of the tumors with this nuclear medicine techniques. Together with clinician, with the images, probably will be meet with the oncologist, and they starting to discuss what is possible for the treatment for the patient. Of course, always, if it's possible, we will think about how to use the surgery. If it's localized disease, but this is any contradiction for the surgery, we could think about the radiation therapy. But if you have the disseminated disease, we need to think about the nuclear medicine and possibly to use the radionuclide therapy. First of all, if we talk about the radioligand therapy, we need to tell them that it is different. They are thinking that it is like the normal drug, which is produced in the one place and it could be sold over the world. But with the radionuclide therapy, it's a different story. We have the isotopes with this short half-life, and it is exactly produced for this particular patient. And this treatment can be, the storage for this more than usually 24 hours. Even we have the half-life of the isotopes longer, the stability of the products is quite short. That, as you can see, we're always talking about the time. Even with this nuclear medicine, it is hidden this multidisciplinary team. Because as I saw you, on this multidisciplinary team for the discussion about this patient way, it's usually presented by nuclear medicine physician. But to manage everything in nuclear medicine, we need to be more multidisciplinary, and that is something which is hidden behind this. We need to have this radiopharmacy. First of all, our radiopharmacist must prepare for us the agent for the diagnostic approach. It was mentioned several times, it's majority this with the gallium, that means a very, very short half, 68 minutes, and it needs to be production on site. With this therapeutic agent, it could be the supply, but always we need to think about this availability, about the production, and that delivery time. Majority of the European countries, as well the US, we have some kind of the regulation how to use the radiation. And if we talk about the cancer patient, we usually need to have for this special nuclear medicine department wards with some regulation, with the dosimetry requirements. And please remember that we give patient radioactive substance. That means that all this waste from this patient is radioactive. And we need to think about some tanks collection and waste management. And of course, that's all the staff who is working with them. That means the nurses, technologists, they need to have this educate how to deal with this patient. And this is the example what is the hidden only with the dosimetry approach. With this, we of course absorb first of all patient, and for the dosimetry to calculate the absorbed doses, we need usually the 3 to up to 5 this post-therapeutic scan. And that means that we involve for these technologies, but very important and very difficult after this is working of the physics. You could see that we need to determine the organs of this delivery of these doses and calculate the curves of the absorption to see what is the absorbed doses and the risk organs as well in the tumors. This is really time consuming. It usually takes between 5 to up to 5 hours. On the other hand, we have in this multidisciplinary team, we have non-nuclear medicine components. That means that the people who are sitting together with us and discuss with us about this patient who will be eligibility for our treatment, that need to understand what you are talking about. That need to understand that after this injection of this radioisotope, this patient will be radioactive, so he or she needs to stay on special nuclear medicine department ward with all this rule of radiation safety and patient management. And they must understand that the people with these mental disorders, with depression, sometimes doesn't meet this criteria to stay for these 5 days of the isolation. And of course, they need something that we talk about, that's the patient selection, that not each of the patient will be qualified for the therapy, because this is exactly based on the imaging. They need to understand our radiopharmaceutical logistics. That means that we have the delivery on this particular date. It is not available on the date. You are, depending on the production on the reactor or cyclotron. That the patient needs sometimes stay the longer on this department for the dosimetry requirement and also with this waste management. So who needs this education training? As you see, that is a very complex and very difficult process. So all the members need this education, but this education, it should be specified on the field of expertise. What we are doing as European Association for it, we are organizing some events through this European School of Multimodality Imaging and Treatment. And this is this courses which was organized that year with the live webinars, online courses, as well in courses in Vienna. We organized together with the ESMO, the joint course of the Theranostic. Even more we have in our pipeline for this 2022. That you could see that the Theranostic using this artificial intelligence and quantification is really important for this live webinars, for this online courses, and as well for advanced course in Vienna. We are planning in July 2022 the repetition of the joint course of the Theranostic together with ESMO. Even more, we are deeply involved. We just received the grants that together with this whole the consortium members, we apply for this Erasmus grant about this education and training for the radionuclide therapy, and we established Radionuclide Therapy Academy. And that project has the gain to map the knowledge about this radionuclide therapy in Europe, as well this launch dedicated training program there. So this is all this learning curve that we are proposing, the starting for this live webinars with online courses, advanced courses, but please remember that the most important is practical training, and the most important is understand to each other. And with this, we need to have understand each other for this multidisciplinary team. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Yolanda. That's a wonderful overview. Now you mentioned, and we look forward to seeing you in the roundtable again. You mentioned that time is always an issue, and our next talk deals with that question of time and the radiopharmaceutical supply chain. And this comes from Martjan Blauhoff, who is co-chairman of the NMEU Communication Working Group. And this one has been pre-recorded. So let's listen to it.
Good morning. The isotopes used in nuclear medicine have half-lives that vary between 13 seconds and 8 days. And production has therefore a lot of complexity. For instance, the calculation of the position in a reactor for the isotopes that is used in 80% of all procedures takes place around 2 months prior to the actual production, and therefore way before the orders from the hospitals are placed. The production process leaves no time for the rectification of errors, because what is ordered today is produced now, delivered tomorrow, and very often used that same day. Still, the industry manages up to more than 99% of on-time in-full delivery of the radiopharmaceuticals. The required and implemented use of low-enriched uranium for target materials to adhere to non-proliferation requirements has led to lower molybdenum-99 yields, more radioactive waste, and therefore considerable cost increase. There is for most products no stock, no warehouse to draw from. Therefore, due to the half-life of the isotopes, a seamless transportation is vital to nuclear medicine. If there is one area where this is true, it is therefore just in time. But the same acronym stands for jam is trouble. Any delay in the transportation chain means a connection cannot be made and goods do not arrive. Too late arrival means product cannot be used anymore and patients not treated. We rely on road and air transport, and airlines each have their individual regulations on amounts of radioactive material they are prepared to take on board. And an airline captain has the last say. He can use his privilege to refuse radioactive material on board. It is dangerous goods, and he can decide this for himself. Brexit, and particularly COVID, have been a huge challenge as regular flights and routes were no longer available, and alternatives had to be found, often in a matter of hours before departure. Lastly, there are only a very few and limited number of qualified road transport companies that can and are allowed to deliver radiopharmaceuticals. A large portion of radiopharmaceuticals is produced in research reactors that in many cases have been in operation for more than 50 years, and they will need to be replaced and or require substantial investment for continued reliable operation. Several initiatives are underway to replace these sites, but the financial impact is very, very large, and governments are no longer investing in them. To secure the European production of radiopharmaceuticals for the future, private investors are needed, and these can only be found if a reasonable return on their investment is to be expected. This is a challenge, and a possibility could be that the EU makes low-interest funding available to support the industry. About 10 years ago, the OECD presented a report where they asked the reactor operators to install the so-called full cost recovery, meaning that the cost of target irradiation for radiopharmaceuticals should be passed through instead of being cross-subsidized. In fact, until then, the government funding of reactors subsidized nuclear medicine in other countries. But in the receiving countries, nuclear medicine, as a relatively small medical entity, was not granted an even moderate increase in reimbursement to pay for this additional local cost. In some countries, the reimbursement for the scan is still at the same euro level as it was more than 20 years ago. And this is the reason why several companies have left the field, and particularly in the technetium areas, the remaining ones are struggling due to this squeeze. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Given that in the UK, where I'm talking from, we can't even get petrol to the pumps, it boggles the mind to think how you get radiopharmaceutical delivery chains to work. We've had some lovely questions coming in through the chat function. Thank you very much for those. Please do send them in if you'd like them to, your questions in if you'd like them addressed during the roundtable. Just type them in and we'll see them. So for our last talk, we're going to focus on the regulatory landscape. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Helen Barker, who is chair of the NMEU Regulatory Affairs and Quality Working Group. That's a mouthful. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much. It certainly is. Right, let me just get things sorted. Great. Well, good morning. I'm Helen Barker and I chair the NMEU's Regulatory and Quality Working Group. It is easy to say. The group monitors the ever-evolving regulatory and quality landscape in which we work, and we call out topics of interest to NMEU members, and ones that require further discussion are circulated for further input from the radiopharmaceutical community. In my day job, I'm VP of Regulatory Affairs at Blue Earth Diagnostics, which is part of the Bracco group of companies. And I've been working in regulatory affairs now for 25 years with the likes of GSK, J&J, Novartis, Amgen on various different products. And the last 5 years has been spent in the world of radiopharmaceuticals. So are radiopharmaceuticals different to other medicines? Yes, they are, for a myriad of different reasons, many of which we've heard already today, and including the ones shown here in orange. There are many aspects of radiopharmaceuticals that make them different to regular medicines. You don't find them in a medicine cabinet in a patient's home. They're not even on the shelf in a pharmacy. They truly are specialist products. However, radiopharmaceuticals are medicinal products. They impact the health of a patient and are prescribed by physicians as part of a patient's workup. As such, radiopharmaceuticals are within the regulatory framework for medicines in the EU. To fulfil the promise to patients of the relevance of radiopharmaceuticals, industry works within the framework of, albeit with the flexibility to account for the specialties of these agents. So let's take a quick look at the regulatory framework which applies to all medicinal products in Europe. So we have in the first column manufacture, and this has its own series of references that need to be adhered to, including the legislation, GMP or good manufacturing process, the European Pharmacopoeia, Butylex, etc. There's also the non-clinical part, and studies conducted here should be to good laboratory practice, GLP, and well, they're done to GLP as required, and there are various guidelines from EMA addressing the specifics that are required for medicines. It is in the clinical studies that safety and efficacy in patients is established, and such studies are carried within the framework of GCP, or Good Clinical Practice, either under the established Clinical Trial Directive or, as of next year, the Clinical Trial Regulation. And we will look at those in a little while. So these three strands are then pulled together and presented to the regulatory agency in order to obtain a product licence or approval under the requirements of the EU Medicine Legislation 2001/83/EC. Once approved, medicines continue to be manufactured to GMP and also undergo continued pharmacovigilance to determine the ongoing positive risk-benefit conclusion. Those already working with approved products also understand that the approval isn't the end of the regulatory activities. Changes to any of the information provided to the regulatory agency over time may require variations to be submitted, such as new product vial sizes, new indications, new safety signals. As we've seen, radiopharmaceuticals are not like other medicines. Fortunately, work has been done within the EU to give rise to specific guidelines aimed at addressing some of these differences. So there are specific guidances for microdose products, where the administered dose is less than 100 micrograms, and it is acknowledged that safety issues arising from the use of the product is likely to be minimal, and therefore a smaller number of non-clinical studies are required. The mode of action of the product itself is often linked to the radionuclide involved rather than the asset, which has given rise to specific non-clinical and CMC guidances. There are many well-used, locally produced imaging agents across Europe, where the efficacy has been demonstrated over many years of clinical use. And so the EU has prepared core SMPCs, summary product characteristics, for these products. For novel products, there's also a core summary of product characteristics for radiopharmaceuticals, with the intention of ensuring consistency across member states with regards to the safety, the use and handling of these products. Safety of the radiopharmaceutical is studied, as we have seen, through the development of products. For radiopharmaceuticals, the safety is also controlled by regulatory agencies and radioprotection authorities, each of whom have their own specific requirements. As this slide shows, there are differences in the viewpoints of regulators and radioprotection agencies, and both require consideration when conducting clinical trials across Europe. The impact of the radioprotection policy concerns from a member state varies across Europe, with the German Radioprotection Agency, BfS, probably having the loudest voice. This can prove challenging when running global clinical studies, trying to manage differing perspectives from various stakeholders, as submission timings are not always in sync with the regulatory approvals. All parties have the interests of patient safety at heart, and it's often the case dialogue helps with resolving issues, and although there are pathways for applicants to achieve dialogue with regulatory agencies, such pathways are not as clear with national radioprotection agencies. Dialogue between the regulatory agencies and the radioprotection authorities is also required as a matter of urgency with the forthcoming implementation of the clinical trial regulation next year. So radiopharmaceuticals, as we've heard a lot today, they are emerging as a relevant clinical therapeutic option in cancer care. This graphic from SNMI indicates the expected global market increase in both radiotherapeutics and radiodiagnostic. And the list on the left is of 22 radiotherapeutics on the market or under development. And this list continues to grow. I appreciate it's essentially unreadable, but it's to give a sense of the volume of activity in this area. And those of you already working here will be well aware of the announcements of new assets undergoing development coming through every week or month. So radiotheranostics in particular is a growth area. The idea that you can see what needs to be treated and then subsequently treat with the same binding motif is especially appealing to clinicians and drug developers. Radiotheranostics also raises regulatory issues with regards to development approaches, and some of these issues do depend on how the agents are being developed. So although an imaging agent is used first in the patient pathway, it may actually be the therapeutic asset that leads from a regulatory discussion perspective. And this can lead to challenges with the logistics scientific advice aspect. Similarly, if the imaging agent is being used only as a patient selection tool for the therapeutic, then how would the Paediatric Investigational Plan, or PIP, requirements be managed should the therapy progress no further for some reason? And if the therapy proves especially efficacious and its development is accelerated, then could that acceleration, I'd say development accelerated, the regulatory aspects of it accelerated? Could such an acceleration also be linked to the imaging agent? And also, when one's doing these studies, you have to bear in mind that there are two investigational products being used in the same study, and therefore full IMP requirements for the imaging agent is required in addition to that of the therapy. Looking to the clinical guidances for radiotherapeutics and radiodiagnostics, one can see that the overriding guidelines for the radiotherapeutic are those for oncology drugs, which address the clinical endpoints and safety considerations. These should be read in conjunction with the general radiopharmaceutical guideline. However, there are no specific guidelines for novel targeted radiotherapy agents in Europe at this time. Again, for the radioimaging component, there are various individual guidances, but no specific guidelines for the use of an imaging agent as a tool for patient selection. These gaps and development issues were recently shared and noted with the EMA during a meeting organised by the NMEU Regulatory QA Group, which was well received by the EMA. And these relationships with the EMA continue to be built and nurtured via the NMEU. Thus far, we've focused on the current regulatory landscape, and we've looked at the current framework and identified some areas that would benefit from improvement or clarification. In terms of New Horizon, the largest change in regulatory framework for drug development in the EU begins in January next year. That is the clinical trials regulation. The clinical trial regulation is the biggest thing to hit regulatory since 2001, and it impacts all interventional clinical studies in one or more member states. Although it doesn't actually come into effect until next year, it has actually been on the horizon since 2014, whilst the computer portal was being developed. All stages of study conduct are impacted by this regulation: study design, study planning, study submission, study conduct, and closing down a study. The biggest changes, with perhaps the greatest impact for radiopharmaceuticals, is that it will no longer be possible to have country-specific protocol amendments. As we saw earlier, input from regulators and radioprotection agencies can differ. In the past, a country-specific protocol may have been sufficient to address some of these concerns. This will no longer be possible under the regulation. Another important mechanistic point is that under the new regulation, only one amendment can be submitted at a time. It is not possible to submit a further update if there is one already under consideration. Since feedback from radio protection agencies is acquired after study approval, this means that study start may be delayed until such feedback is acquired, and further delay may be possible should that feedback require an amendment. As we already know, the timings of feedback from these agencies does vary and timelines are not clear. Other points to note with regards to the regulation is that submissions from multiple countries is all achieved via the submission portal, and it's done via a single submission. The computer portal will automatically direct the application for both regulatory and ethics approval within the relevant member states. Transparency is also highly regarded for the regulation, with most trial-associated documents becoming published, including the protocol, investigator's brochure, the results, clinical study report, and the newly introduced lay language summary of trial results. So we are presently working under the Clinical Trial Directive, that is the existing framework. And this graphic shows the planned transition between these two frameworks, between the directive and the regulation. So there will be a period of time where applicants can choose which framework they want to work within, and that's transition 1. And that will run from the end of January next year through to the end of January 2023. So it's a 1-year period. From January 23, we will then enter transition period 2, where all new studies must be submitted under the regulation framework, but existing ongoing studies under the directive can continue. Now, if your study is still ongoing by the 31st of January 2025, it must transition or be converted into a regulation compliant application. So the new regulation is a new way of working for companies and will require changes to existing processes and procedures. And these transition periods, which we're looking at 3 years, are most welcome. Thus, in conclusion, we have seen that there is already some specific assistance for radiopharmaceuticals in Europe. New regulatory procedures highlight further need for dialogue to deal with the complexities of radiopharmaceuticals. In addition, the explosion of development of the Radiotheranostics space mean that further work is required by regulators to help their development within the European regulatory framework, all of which will serve the patients across Europe. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my co-members of the NMEU Regulatory QA Working Group for their diligence and dedication to working with stakeholders to help smooth the path for regulatory development of radiopharmaceuticals in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Great. So now, oh, there's an echo somewhere. I don't know what. Maybe that will go away. So now it's my pleasure to welcome all our today's speakers to join me on screen by turning on their cameras and their microphones for our closing round table, where we can address questions from the audience that have been coming in via the chat function. And of course, you can still send them during the round table, please do. So I'm hoping I shall see, lovely faces appear in front of me. How nice. Okay, I think we have Fred. So we have Fred, Nicola, Yolanda, and Helen. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, you all gave such beautiful talks. So much to cover. To start with, Fred, you gave a kind of survey of where we've got to, and one question that has been submitted, which is a lovely sort of starting point, is that nuclear medicine is, as a discipline, is almost 100 years old. Why has it taken quite so long to be widely available to patients? Of course, you've all addressed that, parts of that question in your talks, but Fred, would you like to address that, and anybody else?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I think that the major issues that hampered the emerging aspects of nuclear medicine was caused by the complexity of nuclear medicine, handling radiopharmaceuticals, all kinds of regulations and rules made it quite expensive and difficult to grow rapidly. And I think, in my feeling, nuclear medicine still became quite small specialty over the years, and only since PET came into the market, PET imaging came into the market, nuclear medicine evolved very, very rapidly. Nuclear medicine became more important in oncology, and this area is so much important in these days in medicine. And since then, nuclear medicine evolved better and better.
Thank you.
It had to do with the complexity, I think. Maybe some of the other speakers have a different opinion, but
if I may add, you know, that's I started nuclear medicine 20 years ago. That was the time that it was very old, the camera, like Fred just said, and it was only the treatment with the radioiodine. It was not attractive. But now, if you know, this, there are a lot of ongoing on this research area with the new target for this diagnosis as well for the therapy, with the new kind of the radiopharmaceuticals. Helen told us how is difficult the way to achieve these products on the market. But this is really important for us, and this is the changing the game. And in my personal opinion, I think that the PSMA is this major now, the playing on the game, and that will be the change a lot of the field of nuclear medicine. Because till now, this radioiodine, it was, of course, well known. Neuroendocrine tumors, I love it. I work with this patient, and I think that the physio have the same kind of experience. It's really good working, but it was the small number of the patient. But with the PSMA, it will be growing, and we need to be prepared. And with this thing that we needed for it, but we have in the pipeline, like the Ken told us, that we have the new kind of the targets, and probably that will be coming very soon, because now we have the experience how to use it.
Yeah. Okay, Nicola, do you want? Please.
I also remember that in the years before 2000. When clinicians ask for some type of scan, except for pulmonary emboli, it may take a week before the report arrives for the clinician, and they didn't care. It is very, very strange to hear that now, but in these days, nuclear medicine was not so challenging, not so important, and like Yolanda said, there's so much changed around the century.
Yes, if I may, thank you for the question. Yes, I agree that it's a critical question, and I agree with the Fred and Yolanda's comments about the fact that the reasons why there was a so long time to arrive at the approval of some radiopharmaceutical in clinical practice. Probably the reasons were several and different. Some of them are related to the disease, some others are related to the local rules, and of course it's quite different. For me, for example, as a clinician, I can understand that it's much more difficult to design a clinical trial for a radiopharmaceutical compared with our drugs, for example. I can report my experience in Italy, for example. We used PRRT in neuroendocrine tumors since the 90s. And of course, at that time, the PRRT was based on a single institution's initiatives all over the world. First of all, in Rotterdam, as Fred well knows. But at that time, of course, these single local initiatives, of course, couldn't lead to an approval. And after 2 decades, we arrived to design the first phase 3 trial. That, of course, in clinical oncology is quite common. No? So the investments were missing, and of course it was also due to the interest of the first company involved in the field. So I think that the reasons are more than one. And I agree with Yolanda that now time changed. Now it's much easier now to go ahead, for example, in prostate cancer compared with the neuroendocrine tumors that are rare cancers. With the PSMA, it could be theoretically much easier to go ahead to design trials covering several settings of the clinical practice. So I think that now the time will shorten going ahead. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much indeed. Marvelous. Thank you for your thoughtful replies. Okay, we have lots of questions coming in. So in no particular order. One for Helen, since you spoke last. Lydia Kuna asks why she observes a tendency over the years for regulations to become more stringent without there being supporting evidence for those changes. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, why do you think it's happening?
Well, they always say if you want to continue a job, then work in regulatory, because the regulations only get more complicated and more numerous as time goes on. Why does that happen? It's in part because of the myriad of different types of therapies. I mean, we in NMEU think that we're special with radiopharmaceuticals, just-in-time manufacturing. We have CAR T cells as well. Biotechnology gave rise to a whole raft of guidances, and that's why one of the reasons that EMA was developed was to deal with biological assessment. So yes, it does get more complicated because diseases don't get more complicated, but the way they're dealt with is becoming ever increasingly sophisticated. We've talked about the theranostic part and the fact that radiotherapies have been around for a century, but it's becoming more sophisticated and how it's being used by patients. Ultimately, all these regulations are there for the safety of the patient. What can be done up front before it's even got into a patient to sort of give a hint that it will be safe. And there's a lot of medicinal products that don't make it into humans. And so that's why, really, it's for the safety of patients.
Thank you, Helen. I don't know if anybody else wanted to pick up on that point. Please feel free if you do, but no compulsion to do so. No volunteers. Okay. Having you all together seems a marvelous opportunity to discuss what needs to be done in anticipation of the expected increase in demand for theranostics. That could be answered at many levels. What kind of structural changes are needed? What changes in institutions? Who would like to step into that first? Maybe Yolanda, from the point of view of medical training or hospital design or anything.
That's the most important is to understand each other's, and that the clinician will understand how to use and how is, the patient preparation, how is all this way for this patient management because as I told during my talk, and Helen pointed that the radionuclide therapy is different than the normal drugs. This is the starting point. And this is the one of the most important point that we need to sit together because now we have the experience with the neuroendocrine tumors, but in the others multidisciplinary nuclear medicine physicians should be involved. It must be involved for all this therapy planning, because without this will be nothing in the end. Because if the clinician will be planning, for example, the treatment schedule for the Wednesday, but delivery of the isotopes is on Friday, it's not make sense. This very practical reason. But on the other hand, please remember that in majority of European countries, we have the regulation to use some kind of the radiation on this nuclear medicine department wards, and we need it for the facility. And with the growing number of the patient, we need to think about the therapy beds with this, establishing the facility, which is quite costly, with this dedicated staff, with this all the monitoring, as well with the tanks for the waste management. It is really important, because that will be, the staying for the decay time. And that is the thing that all these things we must take into the consideration with the growing number of the patient.
Thank you very much indeed. Who else would like to come in? Nicola.
Yes, I think that Theognostic can have several different impacts on our clinical practical job. As of course, Theognostic, I think from a clinical point of view, is the basis of any clinical approach to any patient. But nuclear medicine probably is the best example of the Theognostic. With the same tool, you can do diagnosis and therapy. So it's theoretically the best. But of course, what Theognostic can change in our multidisciplinary team practice, I think that first of all, it can change our mentality, as we are used sometimes to start from therapy. For example, we have several examples of very good multidisciplinary teams just focused on therapy, on treatment. And of course, in that case, you demand the diagnostic part to other centers, other doctors, and so on. But all of us know that the best basis for the best therapy is the right diagnosis, the right diagnostic approach. So just for that, Theognostic should be our critical key point for the multidisciplinary team, as we should start from the beginning of the clinical history of the patient. That's the point. And I think that now, for example, for neuroendocrine tumors, we have the opportunity to do that, to change our organization in the MDT, just starting from the beginning. From the beginning means to be sure about the right diagnosis. And therefore, the Theognostic tool of nuclear medicine now can give us the best way to characterize the disease from the beginning. And that is also the best way to arrive to the best treatment. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you think it requires a change in medical training, though? Do you think you have to change the way doctors are educated? Please.
To me?
Yes.
To me?
Yes, please. Yes. And then to Yolanda, but both of you, yes.
Okay, so the question is if this can change the training of the figures involved in the field, irrespective of the specialty.
Yeah.
Yes, I think yes, it should change our way of training. As of course, I think that multidisciplinary team is not rather a physical organization or a structural organization, but it should be a philosophy. It should be a sort of way of approaching. And of course, if we manage patients with neuroendocrine tumors, it's logical that all of us should think in a similar way, should approach in a similar way, and that is a different training compared with the training related to the single specialty. Therefore, we need a common training. And also, I would like to take the opportunity of this discussion to say that within the European Society of Neuroendocrine Tumors, the ENETS, we are working on this point to create a figure of the NET specialist. And the NET specialist is irrespective of the single specialty. So the endocrinology, the nuclear medicine expert, the oncologist, all of them should be trained in a similar way. And of course, should have a similar curriculum. And that is my answer, that of course, this Theognostics should change our way of training.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a fact. Sorry, maybe there's a feedback, but okay. It sounds, of course, the perfect way forward. But given that you're trying to do this, what are the challenges that you face in trying to change the way that people view that? That they have to have an expanded view of specialization. Does that go down well? Do people embrace that approach, or is there a challenge there?
Yes, it's quite challenging, in my opinion, to arrive at, and this, of course, will be probably a pathway requiring several years, of course. But the first critical step, yes, I think it's to change our approach. And the challenging points could be that all of us are usually related to our specific training, to our specific society. And of course, we need some scientific society based on the topic. And ENETS is one of the few societies related to the disease rather than to the specialties. So it means that if I am a medical oncologist, of course, I am a member of the European Society of Medical Oncology, okay? And that should be for me a general reference for my global training. But if I would like to approach to NET patients, I need to speak routinely with our other colleagues from other specialties, as that is the best way to learn, that is the best way to grow, and that is the philosophy of the multidisciplinary team. So it's not enough to have the best radiologist in the team, as the best radiology couldn't be enough to treat or to manage a NET patients. But the best radiology should discuss every week with the best oncologist, and both should be interested and involved in the field. And that is the main critical point that we should try to overcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Yolanda, same question.
If I may add, because you know that is exactly that was addressed for the European Union, and with the tender, which was the Erasmus program done. Because you know that they've just realized the radionuclide therapy is different, and that needed, this multidisciplinarity approach, and that we create together with the consortium members, with the different, the part of this team, this Radioligand Academy. And I agree with the Fazio that the most important is to sit together and to discuss about the patient. But that this education, it should be a little different, because this nuclear medicine, they are preparing, they have a lot of the courses during this SMIT, and they know how to use the therapy and how is therapy works. But this clinician needs another type of the education. Nuclear medicine will need the more clinician, that they need to more to know about the disease. How is this therapy schedule? How is the management of the patient? Because nuclear medicine is not only the one approach for this patient. We could, for the neuroendocrine tumors, we have the cold somatostatin analogs, we have everolimus, we have the sunitinib, and where is the place of each of the therapy? and they discuss together in the multidisciplinary team. The same will be for the prostate cancer patient. And as you can see, that all this part of the team need the education. For the nuclear medicine physician, it should be more the education by the clinical part, but for this non-clinical part, it should be this the understanding what nuclear medicine could give them. Like Nicola told us, this phenotyping of the disease, this imaging of this our patient, as well this all this patient management after that. That you know that it's always the complexity of each of these things.
If I could also add as well, from a regulatory perspective, when imaging agents are approved, and indeed when the therapies come through, often, well, with each of these products through the centralised procedure, there will be a risk management plan, and often training is part of that approval. And so many of the diagnostics will have a training programme to ensure the appropriate diagnostic readability of the scans, etc. So it just builds on what Yolanda has already raised as well. So the regulators do also look at the training aspects, but absolutely there is a need, I think, for the broader mechanics of it all, of, you know, is it being made on a Thursday rather than a Monday that you're booking the patients in for?
Thank you very much, Helen. Fred?
There's also a lot of practical issues. Right now we are in the middle of the PSMA discussions, and compared to neuroendocrine tumors, patients with prostate cancer who can be treated with lutetium PSMA are 10 times more frequently occurring than neuroendocrine tumors. In most departments of nuclear medicine throughout the country, these departments have only one or sometimes two beds for patients to treat them with radionuclides, which is an issue. We have to develop a program to have more treatment facilities in the hospitals. And will that be in every hospital, or will that be centralized in larger, especially academic hospitals? That's a discussion we have to go through. On top of that, it means that we have to select more money for that. The lutetium PSMA is about as expensive as Lutathera, for instance, but then 10 times more, because we have 10 times more patients for that. So this will have a huge impact on the cost of treatment of these patients. It is, and I think it will be growing. At this moment, we are looking at patients with end-stage disease, but I expect that also patients with hormone-naive situations will be treated with lutetium PSMA in the future as well, which means a lot more patients. So there are many practical issues, and we shouldn't wait starting the discussions with government, hospitals, etc., etc. There's so much to do.
Sorry, on that topic, Fred, who else needs to be involved in the conversation about this? I mean, already there are many disciplines mentioned, and many different factors come together. But who else does this conversation need to expand to include?
I think it starts with collaboration with the urologists and oncologists, and maybe even the radiotherapists, because they are our brothers in this situation. And if we work together, closely together, and go to health insurance companies and authorities together, then we'll have a large impact, a much larger impact than when we go there alone. Collaboration is key in this situation.
Thank you. Others, please.
I think that Fred touched the point which is the most important, that we need to start talking with the regulatory. And Helen, probably you will give us a little of the advice, because you know that now are on the beginning, and we were waiting for 25 years for the NETTER trials. After that, we were waiting for this long way of the registration and reimbursement. And now this PSMA is coming, and if we will be wait the longer without the talking with the regulation how to deal with this, that will be, that we will be losing the time, and this therapy will be registered but available for the patient after 2 years. Helen, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I know that this reimbursement process is about 12, 14 months, even in very good scenario.
Absolutely. The reimbursement part, really, the development programs need to be incorporating reimbursement considerations at phase 2 onwards. And within Europe, we're talking about oncology drugs here, so that is definitely the centralised process. So it is a one-stop shop for the whole of Europe. Health technology assessments, however, is done on a national basis, and it's very much each member state. And therefore, one can imagine the complexities of trying to have sufficient information and relevant information that satisfies all those different member states. It is very challenging. And the EMA are working really hard actually to try and bring those HTAs together. Post-Brexit, the UK has very much thought, no, this is something that is stopping medicines getting to patients. So they've introduced this Innovations Passport, where the Health Technology Assessment, NICE, and the Scottish Medicines Consortium and the Welsh Payments Agency as well, they're all around the table at the same time. And I think that's what Europe is hoping can happen as well, there, to just bring these HTAs together.
Thank you. Fazio, you wanted to come in.
Yes, yes, I think that I agree with Fred that the comparison lutetium and PSMA or NET and prostate is not the case to be done, as of course they are two different contexts. NETs are rare tumors, prostate cancer are quite frequent, and I agree that the training in that case, in the case of the prostate cancer, the training of the nuclear medicine centers should be differently managed compared with NET, as NET are usually more centralized to some specific centers, and of course there is already a sort of a common culture, no? So it's it's easier for the nuclear medicine to be involved in the NET patient management with these new tools compared with the prostate cancer. But of course, it's not the case to discuss using the comparison between the different fields, as of course we don't need to discuss that, as of course the training should be a technical training to get the right expertise for each specialty, and the clinical training to get the right clinical approach. Okay, so I think that in this case the NET experience could be even be considered a sort of model, as of course in NET for many years we didn't have an absolute evidence, and the first therapies were approved over the last years. So in NET, the clinical discussion, the clinical thinking is still now one of the critical points of the clinical management of the patient. And this, in my opinion, could be utilized as a sort of model of approaching to also other fields, including prostate cancer, when we have many therapeutical options compared with NETs. Okay, so I think that we should develop a new philosophy, and of all the scientific societies should be to give the message related to the topic rather than to the technical training of the single specialty.
Thank you very much indeed. So In your sorry, Fred, please go on.
Yeah, may I add a few words? When I talked about colleagues collaborating with us and trying to achieve new developments, I forgot to mention the patients. For instance, when you take prostate cancer, the typical prostate cancer patient is in his 60s or 70s, retired, has a lot of time, is fully aware of what's happening on the internet and knows everything about new developments with treatments, is involved, at least in most European countries, in the development of new trials. In this country, it is completely forbidden to start new trials without consulting the patients. And that is extremely important. And they are strong and well organized also. For instance, there's an European organization, LOMO or something like that. And they are strong, they are well organized and represented. And we need to collaborate, of course, with these organizations that will really help to achieve new developments. Sorry for forgetting that before.
No. Well, it's been absolutely sort of highlighted in the program, of course, of the meeting, in that we began with the voice of the patient. Yeah. In your fascinating reflections, you've all focused very much on the practitioners and how the practitioners must collaborate and widen the circle of conversation. In her opening remarks, Maria de Graça Carvalho drew a link between nuclear medicine and AI and spoke about AI. I'd be very interested to know how you think AI is going to impact on nuclear medicine and change things, if it is. Would anybody like to address that? Fred, are you feeling bold?
It's a difficult issue. I think in radiology it's quite clear that AI can really help a lot, and is already helping a lot with the interpretation of particular disease types. But I don't know so much. We're trying to make, coming back to PSMA again, we're trying to develop an AI program for reading the PET scans, but you need so many studies to create a common denominator for this. We're not there, but I think it could really help in the right interpretation of the images. I think yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose, yes, from a regulatory standpoint, Helen.
May I add something about this artificial intelligence to this Fred talk, because you know that it's still the place, you know, that with the imaging is really difficult, but you know that the something it's ongoing and it will probably happen, helping us with the dosimetry. You know, this dosimetry for the patients is really difficult, and this physics are not working with the one-step dosimetry to have the one scan, and basis on this one scan to recalculate this dosimetry for the patient. And this is perfectly example in nuclear medicine for the artificial intelligence. That I agree completely with the Fred that with the imaging, we try to do it, but it's not so easy like in the radiology. Radiology, you have the density, it's very clear how to do it. You have a lot of the imaging, but here each of the patients is different, and we have the different variety of this uptake. But with the dosimetry, with this kind of these things, that it could be, you know, that's really, really useful. That we see the place, but you know that is that's starting, not so you know this like you know the advanced like in the radiology.
Well, interesting you should mention that, Yolanda, because in fact a question had come in from Rochelle asking pretty much exactly that. Where does dosimetry stand in relation to radioligand therapy? So thank you very much.
If I may, Adam, please. If I may say something from a clinical point of view on the AI, how can AI help us in our clinical practice? I think that we should also consider how it can help us in terms of research. As of course now, we need AI within our clinical trials, and one of the most critical points, not only for the radiopharmaceutical options, but also for other therapies, is the lack of predictive factors. As for example, we talk about theragnostic. So theragnostic is a wonderful term that, of course, gives the idea that if you get the right characterization with some tracer, you automatically found the therapy. Yes, that is right in terms of the decision making, but it's not enough to arrive to the effectiveness of the therapy. As, for example, the somatostatin receptor in NETs are, of course, the main selection factors for patients who have to be treated with PRRT. But it doesn't mean that all patients will benefit from that. So we need some predictive factor, even within the theragnostic approach. So I think that AI could give us a new tool. Of course, it should be a global effort to put together our series and to design large trials, very well designed, in order to define some predictive factors related, for example, to the imaging, to the functional imaging, that could improve also the theragnostic option that we have now.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, Helen, last word to you. We're almost out of time, but you have a couple of minutes, please.
Right. Well, dosimetry was just touched on by Yolanda, and I'd just like to pull up on that, because absolutely, dosimetry is an incredibly precise way of establishing whether a patient would benefit to the nth degree from a particular therapeutic. It's not necessarily the full way that the phase 3 studies are being run, and often one has, it is more of the approach of one has using the imaging agents to select for the patients who will then go on for the therapy. And I think also we do need to still consider the patient in that sense, because how much more radiation dosing in order to achieve their aims. If the phase 3 studies show that it should be efficacious, then that would be great. But yes, artificial intelligence, there's a myriad of regulations around that as well. They're medical devices, and we'd need to, again, use all that information, a whole host of information, in order to show that they do what we hope that they do.
But in terms of mining vast quantities of data, which presumably are overwhelming everybody a lot of the time, do you think AI has a strong role?
Well, the human brain is incredibly good. So the imagers who read these scans are able to pick up things that, have they? Yes, they probably will do. But it won't be in the next year or so. It's going to take a long time to get that information in, and then it's going to need to be tested in the real world. But absolutely, there's obviously a desire for these systems, and the more that people use them, go, it doesn't work so well here, how can we tweak it? And they will improve. But the human brain is an incredible thing to displace.
Thank you. Well, one thing's for sure, that's a topic that we'll be discussing for years and years and years to come. So it's been such a pleasure speaking to you all. Thank you very much indeed. It's been an amazing morning of information, so thought-provoking, a marvelous overview and view into the future. So thank you all very much indeed. And it only remains for me to pass over to Adonis Kalemis, who is president of the NMEU, for some closing remarks. But from me, it's goodbye. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Hello from my side as well. I have the unpleasant task to close this event. Unpleasant because it was so nice to have all of you here, and also looking at the interest in the questionnaires. For me, I have only three things to say. I would like to thank very much the audience who invested the time to be with us today, and I hope that we illustrate a little bit some tasks, some topics in nuclear medicine that perhaps were not so clear. You can always reach out to an NMEU for further questions. I'm pretty sure also to ENM if we can both associations can answer any questions that follows from this discussion. I'd like very much to thank the speakers, all of you who participated and make this event interesting and useful, hopefully. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank Ms. Gracia Carvalho from the European Parliament for opening this event and for the interest that she showed to our discipline. So thank you all, and see you soon, most likely, hopefully, in flesh and bone next year. Bye-bye.
Thank you.